There are winters a man remembers not for what he endured, but for what he witnessed from a distance, through the wavering glass of a farmhouse window, with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand, and a hush over the fields deep enough to hear his own blood move. The winter of 1887 was one of those. And the boy at the center of it was not a boy anyone in the town of Ashlow, in the Wyoming Territory, thought worth remembering. He was, they said, the Kettering Orphan, and they said it the way one might say a broken plow, or a fence past repair, a fact of the country, and no more. His name was Silas Kettering. He was 13 years old that autumn, and he had been living in a lean-to behind the shuttered smokehouse on his dead uncle's property since the previous spring, when the cough that took his mother finally took her, and the man she had trusted to raise him had drunk himself into the creek 2 months later. He was small for his age. His hair was the color of wet straw. His eyes were the pale, patient blue of high country ice. He did not speak much, and when he did, his voice carried the careful measure of a boy who had learned that words cost more than most people realized. The women of Ashlow noticed him the way a person notices a stray dog, with a passing pity that did not require doing anything. There was Mrs. Josephine Hardacre, the doctor's wife, whose bearing suggested she had been born standing straight. There was Mrs. Ellen Vance, whose husband owned the general store, and whose voice carried across a room without her seeming to raise it. And there was Miss Adelaide Prine, the schoolteacher, 31 years old and unmarried, whose kindness ran shallow, but whose curiosity ran deep. These 3 women, and the circle of 10 or 12 wives who orbited them, ran the social weather of Ashlow. And the social weather, that autumn, blew cold on the Kettering Orphan. They had, at first, offered the customary charities: a blanket from the church basket, a tin of beans from the store, a pair of school lessons that Silas attended in silence, sitting at the back of the schoolhouse in boots 2 sizes too large that had belonged to a farmhand who had died of blood poisoning the previous summer. The boots were his one possession of any material worth. They were black leather, oiled recently by a hand that had cared, and they came almost to his knees. He walked in them the way a man walks in a debt. By late September, the charities had thinned. Charity in a small town is a spring that runs quickly dry when the object of it does not return the expected currency of gratitude. Silas did not smile enough. He did not attend church regularly. He did not, the women observed among themselves at the well, or beside the mercantile counter, seem to understand what was owed him and what he owed in return. And so the small kindnesses stopped, and the boy became, in the ledger of Ashlow's attention, a settled matter. It was in the first week of October that he made the trade that set the whole story in motion. He walked from the smokehouse to the property of old Bram Vessel, a widower beekeeper who lived 4 miles east on a stretch of low ground where the wild clover grew thick in summer. Bram Vessel was 72 and half deaf, and considered by the town to be a man who had outlived his usefulness. He kept 11 hives in a row along the south wall of a stone and sod outbuilding. He sold honey to travelers on the Cheyenne Road and to the 2 saloons in the county, and he lived alone with a black and tan hound so old it could no longer climb the porch steps without a lift. The women of Ashlow had, over the years, decided that Bram Vessel was harmless but strange, and left him to his own weather. Silas walked the 4 miles in his tall black boots. He arrived at mid-morning. He stood at the edge of the yard and waited to be noticed, which took some time, as Bram was inside talking to the hound about a matter that concerned only the 2 of them. When the old man finally came out and saw the boy, he stopped, and he looked at him for a long time, and he said, "You're the Kettering boy." Silas nodded. "Come to sell something," the old man said. Silas nodded again. He sat down on the porch step and began to unlace his boots. He did it carefully, without ceremony, the way a boy might unwrap a package he had been given permission to open. He set the boots side by side on the porch. He looked up at the old man. "I want to trade them," he said, "for a hive." The old man did not answer at first. He came down off the porch. He picked up one of the boots and turned it in his hands. He looked at the boy's bare feet against the cold boards, and he looked back at the boots, and he looked at the boy's eyes. "Winter's coming," he said. "Yes, sir." "Boys need boots in winter." "Yes, sir." The old man set the boot down. "Why a hive?" he said. Silas did not answer for a moment. Then he said, "My mother kept one, before she got sick. She said a hive is a small country that owes you nothing. But if you tend it, it feeds you and warms your walls and mends the little cracks you don't see. She said it 3 times, once each winter. I remember it." The old man looked at him for a long while. "She kept a straw skep," he said. "Yes, sir." "I have one," the old man said. Old. Not the good box kind. Straw. Bees are strong in it. Full colony. It'll winter over if you know what you're doing. I know some, Silas said. The old man nodded once. He picked up the boots. He carried them into the house. He came out a few minutes later with a coiled length of burlap, a small clay jar with wax over its lip, and a set of instructions written on the back of a feed store handbill in a hand so shaky it might have been mistaken for the tracks of a small bird. He led the boy around behind the outbuilding and showed him the skep he meant, a dome of tight-coiled straw, brown with age, wrapped at the base with a strip of hide. The bees inside were quiet in the cool morning. The old man showed him how to lift it, how to carry it, how to set it, how to feed it through the winter with the wax-sealed jar, which held a syrup of honey and water thickened with a pinch of something the old man would not name. Take the burlap, the old man said. Wrap the skep when it gets past freezing. Not before. Set it against a south wall, out of the wind. Bank it with anything dry. Chaff, dry leaves, sawdust, hay. The bees warm themselves. All you do is keep the wind off and the wet out. You do that, and they'll live. And in the spring, they'll give you enough honey to eat and enough wax to trade. Silas listened. He asked one question. What if the snow gets past 6 feet? The old man looked at him with something that was not quite surprising and not quite amusing. Boy, he said, if the snow gets past 6 feet, we all have bigger questions. Silas walked home barefoot, carrying the skep and the burlap sling the old man had rigged for him. The clay jar was in his coat pocket. The handbill of instructions was folded inside his shirt against his skin. His feet, by the second mile, were bleeding a little from the frost-hardened stubble along the road. He did not stop. He passed the outskirts of Ashlow at mid-afternoon, and it was there that Mrs. Ellen Vance, coming out of the mercantile with a bolt of muslin in her arms, saw him. She saw the bundle. She saw the bare feet. She saw the small figure of the boy moving with the deliberate slowness of a person carrying something precious. She did not call out. She stood at the door of the mercantile and watched him pass. She turned to Miss Adelaide Prine, who had come out behind her, and she said, in the voice that carried without carrying, the Kettering orphan has traded his boots for a beehive. Miss Prine looked, and she saw, and she said, merciful heavens. Mrs. Hardacre heard the story before nightfall. By the following Sunday, it had reached every kitchen in the county. And here is the thing about a story like that. It did not travel with cruelty. It traveled with a kind of soft, exasperated pity that is worse than cruelty because it does not admit to itself what it is. The women of Ashlow shook their heads. They said the boy was touched. They said the old man had taken advantage. They said something ought to be done, but they did not say what, and they did not do anything, and the days grew shorter. Silas set the skep against the south wall of the smokehouse on a shelf of flat stones he built up over 3 afternoons. He wrapped it in burlap when the first hard frost came in the second week of October. He banked it with sawdust he carried in a bucket from the abandoned sawmill on the creek, walking 2 miles each way, for buckets a day, for 6 days, until the base of the skep was covered to the height of a man's knee in a wall of packed sawdust that did not move even when the wind rose. But he did not stop with the skep. The women of Ashlow, had any of them looked past the story of the boots, would have seen a boy engaged in a labor that ran deeper than a single hive. In the pale hours before dawn and the long blue hours after supper, Silas Kettering worked on the smokehouse itself. It was not a large building. It was 10 feet by 12, with a stone foundation his uncle had laid 20 years earlier and never finished properly. The walls were plank. The roof was cedar shake, half of it curling at the edges. The door was heavy oak with a leather hinge that had gone stiff. There was, along the eastern side, a shallow root cellar dug into the hillside behind the building, its ceiling made of split logs and its floor of packed clay. His uncle had used it to store salt pork and turnips. It had not been opened in 8 months. Silas opened it. Inside, he found what he had hoped to find, a cool, dry space cut into the earth, 6 feet deep at its center, with walls of clay and rock that did not sweat even in the heat of summer. He knew, from his mother's letter, the one letter she had written to him during her sickness, folded into the front of a cookbook she had left him and marked with a pressed sprig of yarrow, that a root cellar of the right kind could be turned into something more than a place to keep turnips. She had written, in the cramped and careful hand of a dying woman who was trying to teach her son something she was afraid he would need, that the earth held its warmth like a stubborn old woman holds a grudge, that 6 feet down the frost could not reach in an ordinary year, and that a room dug into a south-facing hillside, banked with the right things and roofed against the wet, could keep a person and a small stock of food, and even a hive of bees through a winter that killed the strong man. In their timber houses on the flats. She had written more. She had written about the way certain plants held heat and broke wind. She had written of the dense wild rose brambles her own grandmother had grown along the north side of Spring House in Missouri, planted thick and thorny, so that snow drifted into them and packed and became a wall of dead air that could not be crossed by frost. She had written of the way to store grain in dry ash to keep it from the damp. She had written of straw thick-packed between two walls as a substitute for a proper stovepipe insulation. And she had written, at the very end of the letter, one line that Silas read over so many times that the paper of that line was worn softer than the rest. The women of a town are quick to judge a widow and slow to admit a mistake. Do not wait for them, my son. Work while they are talking. He worked. Through the middle weeks of October, while the maples went to rust and the cottonwoods along the creek dropped their leaves in slow yellow rain, Silas cleared the root cellar, floor to ceiling. He carried out the old shelves and rebuilt them. He mended the ceiling logs where two had rotted at the ends. He cut a small vent shaft at the back, no bigger than his fist, and lined it with a scrap of tin to keep out the burrowing things. He built a second door, an inside door of thick plank, so that between the outer door and the inner door there was a space of 3 feet. An airlock, though he had never heard the word, learned from a diagram his mother had drawn in the margin of her letter and labeled only with the words dead air. Along the outside of the smokehouse, up against the south wall where the beehive stood, he built out an addition, not a room exactly, but a windbreak, of stacked stone chest high, back filled with clay and packed straw. He planted along the north side of the smokehouse, in the last frost-free week of October, a hedge of wild rose canes he had cut and dragged from the creek bottoms and set into the earth in a thick and thorny row. He did not know if they would take by spring. That was not the point. The point was that they would catch the snow. He worked in the boots the old man had given him in trade for another jar of syrup, a pair of split rawhide moccasins, wrapped with strips of wool blanket, ugly and warm and practical. He did not miss the tall black boots. He thought about them sometimes, walking home in the blue cold, and he thought about what his mother had said, and he kept working. The women of Ashlow saw him only in glimpses. They saw him at the mercantile buying twine, buying nails, buying a small block of beeswax, and a handful of salt. Mrs. Vance watched him count out his coins on the counter, coins earned by trapping muskrat down along the creek, and she watched him carry his purchases out into the wind, and she said to Miss Prine, "That boy is going to freeze to death before Christmas." Miss Prine said, "Someone should take him in." Mrs. Vance said, "Someone always says that." Neither of them said it to Mrs. Hardacre. And Mrs. Hardacre, who was the closest thing Ashlow had to conscience, did not think of the boy at all through the whole of October, because her sister had come down from Sheridan with a case of nerves, and there was more than enough sorrow inside her own walls to keep her from looking out them. It was on the last Sunday of October, at the well behind the church, that the cutting line was spoken. Mrs. Vance was pumping water. Miss Prine stood beside her with an empty bucket. A younger wife, Mrs. Lila Trask, who was newly married and eager to belong, had come over to join them, and she asked in the bright and slightly too loud voice of a woman practicing for place at the table, whether it was true about the Kettering boy and the boots and the beehive. Mrs. Vance did not look up from the pump. "It is true," she said. "The child has traded his winter boots for a hive of bees. He has moved into a smokehouse behind his dead uncle's property. He has, I am told, planted a fence of thorns. He talks to no one. He is 13 years old. He will not last." Mrs. Trask said, "Perhaps we should." "There are children in this county," Mrs. Vance said, still pumping, "who have mothers and fathers and are hungry. There are only so many hours in a week. Some children are given hands to hold. Others are given to the country. It is not a kindness to pretend otherwise." The words did not reach Silas at the well. They reached him 3 days later, carried by a boy named Ephraim, who came out to the smokehouse on a dare, saw the beehive and the sawdust wall, and the second door, and repeated what he had overheard his own mother repeating. Silas listened. He did not answer. He handed the boy a small piece of honeycomb wrapped in a leaf. The boy took it and left. Silas went back inside. He read his mother's letter again. He worked. By the middle of November, the smokehouse and the root cellar had become, together, a single system, though Silas did not think of them that way, and had no word for it. The inner room of the cellar he had lined, along its ceiling, with a thick pad of dry chaff bagged in old flour sacks. He He had set the straw skep of bees along the innermost wall of the smokehouse against the shared wall with the cellar, so that the small warmth the bees produced through the winter, a warmth no more than the breath of a sleeping cat, but constant, would rise into the shared timbers and hold. He had built, into the corner farthest from the door, a low shelf on which he placed 6 clay jars of honey, 2 crocks of pickled turnips, a small barrel of dried peas, a bundle of jerk venison from a doe he had shared the kill of with an older trapper in exchange for skinning work, and his greatest prize, a 50-pound sack of cornmeal he had earned by 3 weeks of loading grain for a Cheyenne-bound freighter. He had done, in short, what a 13-year-old orphan with no boots was not supposed to be able to do. He had prepared. The town of Ashlow had not. There had been no severe winter for 6 years. The old men said the country was softening. The young men, who had come to the territory in the recent good stretch, believed them. Wood piles were smaller than they had been a decade before. Roof beams were fewer. The stores of hay were adequate rather than generous. The town's water main, a wooden pipe that ran from a spring on the Hardacre property to the school and the church, had a section of exposed timber along the churchyard wall that no one had rapped because no one had needed to rap it in living memory. The mercantile's coal stove had a chimney that leaned 2 inches out of true. The schoolhouse roof had a soft spot over the north corner. These were the small failures of a comfortable town that had forgotten what the country could do. The first snow came on the 8th of November, a light and pleasant fall of dry flakes that dusted the roads and made the children laugh. The second snow came on the 11th, heavier and wetter, and it settled in the fence corners and did not melt. The third snow came on the 16th, and it did not stop for 4 days, and when it stopped there was 1.5 feet on the flats and drifts to the second story of the mercantile. The women of Ashlow were, by the 20th of November, mildly inconvenienced. The fourth snow began on the 23rd and lasted 6 days. When it ended, there was 4 feet on the flats. The mercantile could not be opened without a shovel and an hour's work. The road to Cheyenne was closed. The doctor's carriage horse fell through the ice at the creek crossing and had to be shot. 2 of the outlying homesteads sent boys in on snowshoes to buy flour and salt and returned with less than they had come for because the mercantile was running short. The women of Ashlow, by the 1st of December, were afraid. Silas Kettering, on the 1st of December, was not. He rose in the blue hour before dawn. He wrapped his moccasined feet in a second layer of wool. He stepped through his inner door, then his outer door, into the space he had built between them, and out into the still, sharp cold. He walked the perimeter of his small property. He checked the burlap on the skep. He checked the packed sawdust. He listened to the low, warm hum of the bees, which had not diminished. He checked the wild rose hedge along the north wall, which had done exactly what his mother had promised, caught the snow, held it, and became itself a wall of dead air 3 feet thick and rising. He looked out across the fields toward the town, whose chimneys smoked thinly and whose lanterns burned late into the mornings now. He watched. He went back inside. 3 days into the storm that came on the 4th of December, the storm that would be remembered in the territory as the Great December Fall, she noticed that the smoke from the Hendersons' chimney had stopped. The Hendersons were the family on the ridge above the smokehouse, a mother, a father, for children, a hired man. They were not friends of Silas. They were not enemies. They were a family who had waved to him twice in the past year and had not otherwise spoken to him. Their chimney from Silas's small window was ordinarily a plume of gray at all hours. On the 3rd day of the December storm, the plume was gone. On the 4th day, it was still gone. Silas stood at his window for a long time. He thought about his mother's letter. He thought about the line he had read over so many times that the paper was soft. He thought about the boots. He thought about the well and the words Mrs. Vance had said, which had reached him through the boy Ephraim, like a wire tightening around a young tree. He put on his coat. He put on his mittens. He put on his wrapped moccasins. He tied a length of rope from his belt to the doorpost, because his mother's letter had said twice that in a whiteout a man could lose his own barn if he lost his rope. He stepped out into the storm. It took him 2 hours to reach the Hendersons' ridge. It was a distance of half a mile. When he arrived, he found the chimney cold, and the door drifted shut, and no smoke rising, and no sound but the wind. He dug the door out with his hands. He knocked. There was no answer. He knocked again. He tried the latch. It gave. Inside, the family was alive. Barely. The stove had gone out on the second night, when the last of their dry wood had run through it faster than they had expected. The father had gone out to bring in more from the pile. He had not come back. The mother and the children and the hired man had huddled in the front room under every blanket in the house. They had done what people do when they run out of options. They had waited, and they had prayed, and they had grown quieter. The youngest child, a girl of 4, was breathing in the shallow way that Silas remembered from his mother's last week. He did not speak. He looked around the room. He looked at the mother, whose face he had seen exactly twice in his life. He looked at the hired man, whose name he did not know. He looked at the child. He turned and went back out into the storm. He walked the half-mile home along the rope he had run out from his door because he had thought before he left to bring a second rope and to tie one end to the Hendersons' porch post as he went in. He worked his way down that rope. He did not lose the way. When he reached the smokehouse, he loaded a small sled, a thing he had built out of scrap plank in October, with runners of split ash, with 3 armloads of split cedar, a jar of honey, a small pot of syrup, a wool blanket he had traded a rabbit for, and a covered clay pot of hot stew he had set on the low iron stove that morning, without knowing why. He turned the sled around. He walked it back up along the rope. He built the fire himself. He did not ask permission. The mother watched him. The hired man watched him. The children watched him. He fed the stove kindling first, then the smallest split, then the larger. He set the pot of stew on the top. He melted a little of the honey into a cup of warm water and fed it, teaspoon by teaspoon, to the small girl. He put a warm stone from a hearth into the wool blanket and set it against the girl's feet. He said nothing. When the room had come back to a temperature at which a person could think, the mother of the family, a woman named Ruth Henderson, who was 34 years old and who had for times that autumn walked past Silas on the road without meeting his eye, sat down at her own table, and began to weep. The hired man went out and, with directions from Silas, found the father 20 yards from the woodpile, half buried and unconscious, and dragged him inside. The father lived. He would lose 2 toes and the tip of a finger. He would live. Silas stayed 1 hour more, feeding the stove and watching the child breathe, and then he took his empty pot and his empty jars, and he went home along the rope. He did not tell anyone. The Hendersons did. By the 6th day of the storm, the story had crossed the 4 miles to the town, carried by the hired man who had made the journey on snowshoes to fetch a doctor for the father's frostbite. By the 7th day, the story was in every kitchen in Ashlow. The women who had said the Kettering orphan would not last through Christmas heard, from the hired man's own mouth, the account of a boy in wrapped moccasins arriving out of a whiteout at a dying family's door with a pot of stew and a jar of honey, and the practical wordless competence of a man 3 times his age. They did not know what to do with the story. They tried, at first, to fit it into the frame they had built. They said it was a mercy of God. They said the boy had been lucky. They said he had been given, perhaps, some old family knowledge from his mother, and had gotten lucky with the layout of his uncle's smokehouse. They said many things. But the snow kept falling. On the 11th day of the storm, when the total fall on the flats had reached 5 feet, and the drifts had passed 6, the mercantile's coal stove failed. The chimney, tilted 2 inches out of true, and now, weighted with 3 feet of ice, cracked at the joint and dumped smoke into the store. The store closed. The families who had been buying flour and salt on daily runs suddenly had no flour and no salt. The wooden water pipe that ran from the Hardacre spring to the church, unwrapped along the churchyard wall, froze solid on the 12th day and burst on the 13th. The schoolhouse roof, soft in the north corner, took on so much snow that the beam gave way, and the whole northeast room collapsed in a slow, groaning fall at 3 in the morning. No child was in it, because school had been closed for a week. But the coal that had been stored there, the last coal in town, was buried under 6 feet of debris and snow. By the 15th day, Ashlow was in trouble. Mrs. Josephine Hardacre, who had spent the first 11 days of the storm caring for her sister with the nerves, and who had on the 12th day walked into her kitchen and found that the pump handle had frozen and the pipe behind the wall had cracked, sat down at her table, and for the first time in her adult life, did not know what to do next. Her husband, the doctor, was 2 counties away, snowed in at a berth he had gone to attend the week before the storm. Her sister was sedated in the upstairs bedroom. Her larder held 3 days of food if she rationed carefully. Her woodpile was gone. She looked out her window at a town where every chimney she could see was either thin-smoked or cold. She thought, for the first time in weeks, of the Kettering boy. Miss Adelaide Prine, on the 16th day, walked out of her boarding-house room and knocked on Mrs. Vance's door. Mrs. Vance opened it, and the 2 women stood looking at each other in a silence that neither of them knew how to break. Mrs. Vance's kitchen behind her was cold. Miss Prine's mittens were thin. Neither of them, in the whole of that winter, had once been outside without a fire waiting for them at the end of the walk. Neither of them was sure, at that moment, when they would next feel warm. "We should go to him," Miss Prine said. Mrs. Vance did not have to ask who. They had a small party. Mrs. Hardacre came, in her fur cloak that had been fashionable in Baltimore 10 years earlier, and was now merely warm. Mrs. Trask came, with her infant in a bundle strapped to her chest under 3 layers of shawl. The hired man from the Hendersons, Silas's silent advocate, came to guide them, because he had walked the road twice now and knew the drifts. They set out at mid-morning on the 17th day. The wind had, for the first time in a week, dropped to a manageable strength. The sky was the pale, hard blue of ice in a bucket. The distance was 4 miles. It took them 5 hours. Silas Kettering saw them coming. He had, since Henderson Day, established a habit of standing at his window for an hour each morning after his rounds, watching the road. His mother's letter, that was where the practice had begun. She had written, in a passage he did not fully understand until that week, that the true measure of a shelter was not whether it kept you alive, but whether it left you with anything to give. He watched the road because he wanted to be ready. He was 13 years old, and he was ready. He saw the small, dark line of figures against the snow, half a mile out, and he knew who it was, though he did not know each face. He turned from the window. He set the iron pot on the stove. He stirred into it the last of the venison, a handful of dried peas, a spoon of honey, a pinch of salt, and enough water from the covered barrel to make it stretch. He added a second pot. He lit a second lamp. He opened the outer door and propped it. He opened the inner door and propped it. He set 6 clay cups on the low table. He stood in the small warm space he had built with his own hands over 3 months, and he waited. The women came up the last rise. They came through the wild rose hedge, which was buried in a drift so high and dense that only its topmost thorns showed like the teeth of a broken comb. They came around the corner of the smokehouse. They saw the packed wall of sawdust and the burlap-wrapped skep, from which, even in the killing cold, a faint hum could be heard by anyone who knew to listen. They saw the 2 doors, the outer and the inner, both propped open in welcome. They saw, standing in the space between them, a small boy in wrapped moccasins and a coat 2 sizes too large, with pale, patient eyes and hair the color of wet straw. She opened the door before they knocked, though the door was already open, and she said the one sentence she would speak in the whole of that winter, not to answer them, and not to accuse them, and not to forgive them, but because it was the plain and practical thing that needed saying. "Come in, she know." He said it. Silas said it. In a voice quiet as the settling of sawdust, "Come in. There is enough." They came. In. They sat where he showed them to sit. He fed them. He fed the infant first, a warm spoon of honey water, the way he had fed the Henderson child. He fed Mrs. Trask next because she was the mother of the infant and had walked 5 hours in a shawl that was not enough. He fed Miss Prine and Mrs. Hardacre and Mrs. Vance in that order, though the order did not matter and no one in the room understood why he had chosen it. He fed the hired man from Henderson's son, and he gave that man the largest cup because that man had walked the road 3 times in 3 days. The women did not speak. They ate. They drank. They watched the boy move around his small, warm room with the unhurried competence of a person who had thought carefully about every corner of it. They watched the light from the low iron stove throw a shape onto the wall, the shape of a straw skep on the other side of the shared timber, warming his room by the breath of 10,000 small bodies. They heard, when the wind fell for a moment outside, the low, steady hum of it. They understood, without being told, what the boy had traded his boots for. They understood, also without being told, what they had said at the well. Mrs. Vance, who was proud, and who had in her 43 years never apologized for anything except a broken teacup, opened her mouth twice and closed it twice. She looked at the boy. She looked at her hands. She said nothing. It was, in the end, the greater dignity to say nothing. She would carry the not saying of it for the rest of her life, and she would pay for it in the quiet coin of remembering. Miss Prine cried without sound. Mrs. Hardacre, whose sister lay sedated for miles away, in an unheated house, asked the boy, practically, as one asks a doctor, how much we had, and how much food, and whether he could spare, if it were carried carefully, a pot and a lamp and a few armloads for the journey back. He gave them. He gave them without hesitation and without ceremony, and he told them what to do with each thing, and they listened to a 13-year-old boy the way they had never in their lives listened to a 13-year-old boy, because he was in that room, the only person present who knew what he was doing. They went home before dark. They took with them what he had given. Mrs. Hardacre would, that night, keep her sister alive with a small stove and a jar of honey and a pot of pea stew heated over cedar coals. Miss Prine would, the next morning, take a bucket of the same stew to a family 2 doors down whose father had broken his ankle on the ice. Mrs. Vance would, on the 3rd day, walk back out to the smokehouse alone, and would stand at the door a long time before she knocked, and would say to the boy who opened a sentence that history did not record, and that neither of them ever repeated. The storm broke on the 23rd day. The sun rose on a country buried past its fence tops, past its haystacks, past the sills of its 2nd-story windows. 2 men in the county had died. 6 had been maimed. 1 barn had collapsed and killed a milk cow and a pair of hogs. But every family in Ashlow that had come to the door of the Kettering smokehouse, or that had been reached in time by the boy who lived there, had lived. In the first thaw of March, when the drifts fell in on themselves, and the creek broke, and the wild rose hedge along the north wall began, tentatively, to bud, Silas Kettering opened his skep and found the bees alive. He carried the hive out into the pale spring sun and set it against a warming stone. He watched the first foragers leave for the earliest willow. He listened to the low, steady hum, which was no different in March than it had been in December. He thought, without any particular emotion, of the tall black boots he had traded away. He thought of his mother's letter, and the sentence about widows and mistakes, and the sentence about working while they were talking. He folded the letter and put it away. He did not read it again. He did not need to. Old Bram Vessel came out from Ashlow in April, walking slowly, and stood in the yard and looked at the smokehouse and the cellar, and the wild rose hedge and the skep. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "You did it right, boy." Silas said, "My mother told me how." The old man nodded. He gave Silas a 2nd skep, a gift this time, not a trade. He walked home. The women of Ashlow, that summer, did not speak of the winter often. When they did, they spoke of it in a lowered voice, as one speaks of a grave miscalculation that has been survived only by the mercy of something outside oneself. Mrs. Vance became, in the years after, a quieter woman. Miss Prine took to visiting the smokehouse once a month with a basket of things Silas did not need, and sitting on his porch step, and speaking of small matters, and leaving without any expectation of reply. Mrs. Hardacre, who had the least to answer for, and yet felt it the most, sent her husband the doctor out to check on Silas twice a year, without charge, until Silas was a grown man. The boy himself did not change. He grew. He kept bees. He kept the smokehouse and the root cellar and the wild rose hedge. He married at 24 a woman from a homestead 10 miles east who had, as a small girl, been one of the Henderson children in that back room on the 4th day of the December storm. She remembered the honey water on the spoon. She remembered his face. She had waited 11 years, quietly, for the age to be right. She did not tell him she had waited. He did not tell her he had noticed. There are winters a man remembers not for what he endured, but for what he witnessed, and the winter of 1887 was one of those, and the person at the center of it was a boy who traded his boots for a beehive, and was called a fool for it by women who did not read the letter his mother had left him. And the letter, which is the reason a man can tell this story now, though he was only a farmhand at the Hardacre place that year, a boy of 10 who carried the wood, and heard the women talk, and watched from a distance. The letter said only what a mother says who knows she will not be there. Work while they are talking, and open the door before they knock, and feed them first who walk the farthest, and do not, ever, wait for the town to admit its mistake. Preparation is not stubbornness. It is a form of love, for the people who will need you when they finally admit they do. If this story stayed with you, another one is already waiting on the shelf beside it, warm as a stove in a small room where 2 doors stand open.